Do you constantly impinge your hip, or are you lacking range of motion in your lower body? Why is that happening? To understand that, we really need to have a look at the anatomy of our hip. So what is the hip? So it's a ball and socket joint, with the ball being the head of our femur and the socket being this indented cup-like structure in the pelvis. So we're talking about things like impingement. We really need to understand the capsule, which is a ligamentous structure, and all those ligaments around the joint. So one of those important structures is the labrum. What does the labrum do? It provides stability, it grips the head of the femur, and it provides like a negative pressure. So what that means is it basically suctions everything in, so we're not going to essentially have like a dislocate occur. Now if we look at the capsule more generally, it gets stretched in a bunch of various positions. If we're wanting to stretch the front side though, any sort of extension is going to stretch it. If we want to stretch the maximum amount of fibers in the capsule, we can combine extension with abduction and internal rotation. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because there are a lot of joint mobilizations which really target the capsule. I'm very intrigued by the fact that we can stretch a lot of the capsule all at once, because it might be a more efficient way to work on a mobilization. And I guess on that topic, we can look at how things go wrong in the hip. I'll come back to the capsule in a moment, but if we see limitations in range of motion, say a limitation in adduction, often that can be due to some sort of passive tension in the abductors, so the opposing side of the joint. This is a pretty common theme with passive tension. Like for example, you can extend the hip say 20 degrees past neutral, but if you flex the knee, you can basically only get to neutral. Right, because of the passive tension. Now I don't yet know how to address passive tension, but it's often a good indicator that something that isn't the pain point or the lack of range is responsible. It's not the actual structure itself, not in all cases. Now if we come back to the capsule, we can get something called capsulitis, which is swelling or inflammation in a capsule. And what they've shown is that this is associated with inhibition of the glute max. Now that is such an important point. So glute amnesia is this sort of commonly reported condition where people with low back pain get this inability to fire the glutes. It's something that I've discussed previously on sort of how to address on this channel. But this is a point that I hadn't come across before. So if we're having this inflammation, we have another block to activating the glutes. And I think this explains so much of the frustration around glute amnesia. It's like, I just can't get it. No matter what I do with massaging and with cueing, that there's something else going wrong here, right? That's what's causing the inhibition. So I think that's just really interesting that there's another piece to the puzzle. Also, if you get this inflammation in the capsule, what's really common is that people come into like a mid-range flexion. And the reason for this, it's where the least amount of pressure is on the capsule. Right? So it's the most like comfortable position. But the issue with that is now you have this sort of chronic position that you're in that you're finding more comfortable, but then you're developing like a compensation. You're getting some tightness in your hip flexors. Basically getting like a chronic contracture in that area. So as a result, now it's hard to get into an extension. Like we've limited ourselves, we've created this horrible posture as a way to deal with the pain that we were in. Now there's a few structures that can be implicated in this, so it could be that we have tight hip flexors, it could be that we have weak hip extenders, they've been put on stretch for too long. So the program that's generally recommended to address this is to strengthen the extensors and to stretch the flexors. Even if an inflamed capsule isn't the reason that you have a limitation in your extension, it could also just be to prolonged sitting, again, being in that sort of flexed posture. So you're seeing like a general pattern about how these positions and these compensations come about. And again, there are some other ways to address issues in these areas. So like, for example, addressing the glute max. It's pretty much the McGill method recommendations. It's starting in like a side-lying clamshell and then side-lying abduction, so lifting your leg up to the side. And then something called quadruped fire hydrant was recommended, which is pretty much just being on all fours and doing like a big hip circle with a bent knee. And I found that very interesting because those are very glute med dominant exercises that were suggested, but yeah, apparently they also help with the glute max involvement. And if we look at the glute med specifically, a single leg hip bridge seems to be the thing that leads to the most EMG activation, the most muscular firing basically. Now if we look at the glute minimus, I think this is a very intriguing structure because there's some potential that it's involved in impingement, basically because it inserts into the capsule and it might, they're not sure, but it might retract the capsule somewhat, which would help the capsule not get impinged. So I guess a natural follow-on from that is potentially if you're seeing some sort of lack of activation through the glute minimus, is that the capsule's not being pulled away, we're getting impingement. Right, so maybe we need to strengthen the glute min. And when we're discussing how to rehab the hip, I think I'd be remiss not to mention that the hip can have, like any other joint, different actions at different joint angles and functions that you're trying to achieve. So for example, at about 60 degrees of hip flexion, some external rotators can change their action to internal rotators. I think this can be a really perplexing point. It's like, what does this muscle do? Why is it important in this movement? Like, I thought it was an external rotator. Why does it matter when I'm doing internal rotation? Like, I don't have a perfect answer for how to address that and take that information to every movement, but I think that it shows that if you are feeling lost, if you're thinking, I've done all the external rotation work, it's just not working, or I've done all the internal rotation work, it's just not working, there might be another avenue there. There might be other structures that you can tap into that you thought previously were functionally not helpful. For those of you who don't know, I've been learning all of this and more as a part of my 50 Days to Rebuild challenge, where I do 50 minutes of exercise and read 50 pages of a physio book in an attempt to rehab myself. I've learned all of what I'm speaking about today from Newman's Kinesiology. Looking at the exercise portion of things, starting off with the side plank, I've been messing around the last couple of days with sort of how I push through and squeeze my glutes, something I've been really trying to focus on a bit. And I have noticed that whatever I was doing previously, not too great. I was kind of trying to push down while I squeezed. I felt like this was going better, but I'm noticing like I'm not as symmetrical, I'm not sort of as stable, and I think I just, again, need to focus on that butt squeeze. But from what I've learned today, there might be something interesting about trying to, reduce inflammation in the capsule. That might be a way to increase that activation. I do want to say, of all the things I've been doing in this challenge, I think that the hip bridge has probably been the biggest success. As of today, it's pretty easy. Like, again, I had this glute amnesia. I had massive hamstring dominance. I could not get a mil off the ground without my hamstrings fully taking over the movement. I'm not saying I get no hamstring activation, but it's negligible. And I don't think that's a bad thing if there's some present. We just don't want it to be the driver of movement. Looking at the wrist, today is the first day I've experimented with the dart movement. So this is one of the movements that I've covered that seem to be really helpful for wrist rehabilitation. So I figured I'd give it a shot. Overall, it's feeling good. It's a little hard not to crack, which always concerns me with any sort of wrist rehab. I know some clinicians and things will say, oh, it's fine if it cracks as long as it's not painful. I think that's bullshit. I don't think things should crack. I think that shows that you're lacking integrated stability and tension, and that the tension is jumping to another structure that it shouldn't be, or some sort of impingement, some sort of bony structure is quickly passing past somewhere that's painful and unstable to sort of get out of that position. In the case of my wrist, it wasn't too bad. I was sort of able to manage it, but yeah, something to build up, I guess. And yeah, that is about it for day 49. Only one more to go after this. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.